Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure indeed and a privilege to be here with you today to talk about what might appear on the surface to be a fairly common sense topic, one that I have certainly been engaged with in more ways than one. I must, though, confess that it does escape common sense in many cases, because be able to build relationships is by itself difficult to begin with, and to do so in a remote, almost invisible environment becomes a bit challenging. And as I was thinking about today's event, I harkened back to what I call basics. And that is, how do we, in the current environment that we're in, establish relationships that can be enduring? And of course, my inquiry and thought takes me into the literature, into practice, and from its surface, on more occasions than I can count, the value and role that trust and empathy have in facilitating the development of relationships with others. I will set the stage for us so that we understand that what I characterized as common sense now has some new flavors given the environment that we're in. And it's in the context of this environment that I think what is important is the facility to be able to develop what I call cognitive facts. And simply stated, what it means is that we must have an ability always to recognize that the world that we're in is organic, it's dynamic, it's changing, it's never standing still, and therefore we have to be continuously adapting and adopting whatever it is makes the most sense given the environment that we're living with. And so in the context of us being able to have the capacity to exercise this flex, I'm going to invite you to explore with me three fundamental skills, I would say, that are essential for building relationships with others. You know, what was interesting to me, not too long ago, it occurred to me that the world was engaged in two common threads, totally engaged in two common threads. Of course, the subject that triggered these threads is this invisible menace that we are currently facing, the disease that surfaces from this invisible menace that we've now labeled COVID-19. At the same time as we were cognitively engaged with the subject of this invisible menace, universally, and when I say universally, I mean that quite literally, because I'm fairly well connected. I've opened education programs and have done development work, professional development work globally. And I talk to people around the world. If there was one other common thread besides the subject of COVID-19 was this incredible emotion of fear. Fear has enveloped our globe, and we're all living with that as I speak to you. And the combination of those two threads have effectively turned our entire globe over its head. We've shut down economies. Our economy has gone through a traumatic shift, and the expression of that trauma, apart from the realities that we hear about every day in terms of unemployment and furloughs, and managing our supply chain systems and ensuring that we're still able to function, at least to the extent that we can provide the support that our communities need, it has resulted in a workforce shift to another space, into homes in our instance, rather than just pure remote work where you can work from anywhere. Really, these days, people are working from home. And so it's in the context of this envelope fear that we suffer from, the focus we have on this invisible enemy, and the fact that we're now immersed in an environment that has a certain level of permanence that gives rise to a whole series of dynamics. I want to just for a moment pause and look at the slide. This was my subjective garnering of language that I was hearing being spoken in social media channels, in print media, on the news, in telephone calls, even in whispers through the highways of the globe. And of course, you can see this word cloud, this language cloud, that speaks to what preoccupies us. To a large extent, we're talking about hands being washed, maintaining distance, protective equipment for all of our heroes, whether they are healthcare folks or otherwise essential workers. Even our garbage collectors need to have protective equipment. So there's a lot of conversation. And now we're talking about full-time mom, full-time dad, children and education at home. Imagine that. They're not in school. And especially if you have younger ones who have, of course, the idiosyncrasies that come with youth and young age. And then couple that with this other thread that seems to be clouding our reality, and that is our emotional vortex. Fear, clearly, is paramount. And now, of course, with the layoffs and the furloughs and the forced isolation of family units into the privacy of their homes has given rise to not just the reality of fear that led us to where we are, but now we have job loss concerns, we have anxiety, we have loneliness, we have isolation, and incidentally, this might seem strange, even burnout is reality, because in the context of doing remote work, we tend to sometimes overdo it, and that can create some adverse consequences for us. Now, it's in the context of this global reality that we are seeing the disappearance of the days we were accustomed to. Think about these days that we took for granted. We walk into the office, we bump into a colleague while we're walking through the hallways, we hang around the coffee pot, or we gather for water around the water cooler. We have informal encounters, we'll go out for lunch, we'll have business meetings. In all these cases, there was a certain vitality, there was a richness to the interactions we had with other people. And now we've been forced away. And that forcing away is an invitation for us to become aware of what I've called cognitive flex, a continuous adaptation to the environment we're currently faced with. In comes what? In comes this kind of a scenario. This is where we are right now. You know, it was interesting. I'm working with a client, and we were talking about, I was going to do a workshop, and then the large financial institution that I was going to do this workshop for had decided that remote work was going to be the modus operandi. And so everyone went into hibernation, if you would, in the comfort of their homes. And you have this scenario. And by the way, I've talked to people. In fact, I have neighbors, sometimes socially distant exchanges. When I see a working couple with an 18-month-old child, it's a whole new ballgame. Right now, we have obligations that both members of the family unit have. We both work, spouses are working, we have children. Education now is no longer accessible, daycare centers are not available. Our whole role shift has occurred where we're now nursing, caring, cleaning, cooking, and at the same time, we also have to interact with our colleagues and our bosses. Thank God for the power of technology, which I'm going to speak to later on, in how it's going to really engage us at a level of intimacy we could not have imagined before. We also have to, of course, deal with our customers. In all cases, this presents us with the reality of continuously looking for opportunities to be able to manage this reality and allow us to maintain our sense of well-being. So let's talk about what I see based on the title that you heard, that perhaps enticed you to register for this webinar. What you didn't hear me speak in that title, or at least read in that title, was the power of the concept of listening, which to me is the foundation. If you do not have the capacity to listen, then the power of trust and empathy, the capacity to trust and the capacity to empathize diminishes. So I'd like to spend some time on listening. And I find it very interesting, and I'm sure many of you would concur, that rarely, if ever, have we trained people in the art of listening. Rarely have we given people formal training in how you are able to narrow the distance between yourself and someone else. And that's what listening is all about. When you listen to understand, you can think about it as in terms of the metaphor of wearing a glove that fits your hand. You've got to be able to bridge the space between yourself and someone else. And the question becomes, how do you do that? Well, you begin with what I think is enormously powerful, and that is self-awareness. Self-awareness as a listener. What am I talking about? I have found it repeated relentlessly in my professional life, where people will engage in listening and lose sight that they're listening. They build their own scripts, our own biases, our own prejudices, invite us on more occasions than we can remember to actually build scripts. And once we start building these internal scripts, we stop listening. I'm going to give all of you a very specific example. And although I cannot see you all, I'm willing to bet my professional reputation that the majority of you, if not all of you, have actually experienced what I'm about to share with you. How many times have you sat listening to someone? You're listening to me right now. There may be something I would say that could trigger a rebuttal, something I could say that would trigger a wait a minute, I would like to ask the question or I'd like to respond. As soon as you find yourself, in the mode of preparing a response, you've stopped listening. Most people don't recognize that, right? We call that in the communications literature, we refer to that as defensive dominance. What you're doing is really training your rebuttal, practicing your rebuttal, and while you're doing that in your head, you've effectively turned off the speaker whom you are ostensibly supposed to be listening to acknowledge understanding, to acknowledge the reduction of that space. And by the way, acknowledgement is a behavioral phenomena. I cannot emphasize enough the power of acknowledging the other person. It's a behavioral issue that helps to facilitate listening, but it also, and you'll see me coming to it shortly, it also facilitates an understanding that you've conveyed an empathic capacity. It also allows you to be able to build a relationship grounded on the concept of trust. And language, incidentally, in this process is very important. And I'm being very specific by way of giving you an example that's on the screen. It may be obvious, but I hope it will at least capture your imagination in terms of how you should get the best out of people to promote an understanding so that there's oneness in thought, which is really what perfect understanding is about. And so it's a case of, use language, not like you're seeing in the first instance here. You try asking others who've worked on similar projects for advice. That kind of framing leads to only one type of response, a binary response, one that's yes, I did, no, I didn't. Now imagine just shifting that slightly to share with me in how many ways or what ways you have reached out to others for advice. Now the invitation is not a yes or no. Now the invitation is actually an attempt to try and share those thoughts that are resident in my mind, crafted in the words that I'm going to convey to you, which hopefully will give you insights on my thinking, and hopefully that should bridge the space between us. So focusing on the listener, that's part of the message really here, but there's even more explicit ways how we can focus on the listener. And it's called engaging actively, engaging in active listening. And the easiest way to engage in active listening is to engage in what I call reflective speak. Paraphrase other people. Paraphrase what the other party is saying in your own words, and then play it back and ask for affirmation of understanding. It's a very powerful way of bridging the gap between you and someone else. So think about that. And incidentally, this can also happen in digital channels. We'll talk about that very shortly. The other thing that's interesting is how many of you are truly comfortable with silence? Another very powerful component of the listening phenomena, you have to become comfortable with your own silence. And I harken back to what I said earlier about how you start building your own script based on biases and prejudices. If you're comfortable with silence, you can wait, allow yourself to be able to hear what the other party is saying, and then develop a response if that's what you intend to do. You also want to change, especially in the context of our current environment where we want to build relationships. We have to really shift our mindset. We have to really get away from I, me, and mine. We need to now think about how we're all in this together. So if we're all in this together, it's really about us. It's about reinforcing the message that we understand we're in this together and I have your back. And part of that comes from having a mindset, and this is critical. It is an intentional mindset that you're invited to consider, and that is a win-win mindset. Never a win-lose or a lose-win. In those mindsets, one of the two parties will walk away feeling completely dissatisfied. You don't want that. If you want to build relationships, you don't want to create distance. You want to be able to narrow that distance. And one way to do that, even in conflict situations, by the way, folks, even when you disagree with somebody, a win-win mindset allows you to have the possibility to produce an outcome that is favorable to both parties. Now, we've been divorced, right? We're away from work. We're away from our regular routine. We're now at home. I cannot tell you how important it is to maintain contact with the mothership. You're not going to the office. You're not arriving in the parking lot. You're not walking up the steps or taking an elevator or an escalator. You're removed from there, and you oftentimes end up wondering what's going on at the mothership. You don't get the hallway interactions. You don't get the water cooler gossip. You're not part of the informal network of conversations that are occurring. That's why all the more you need to stay in touch. And so frequent check-ins is absolutely essential, not only to be able to link to other people, but also to manage your own well-being. So it is the foundation. And by the way, lots of companies actually go through listening exercises as a way of getting people to become much more aware of this incredible gift that we can cultivate and be so much better at being able to do the other things we're going to talk about. It is through a foundation in listening that we're able to build the capacity to, the capacity to empathize. Let's look at that for a second. Let's look at that for a few minutes, actually, not a second. But this just gives you a global view of the kind of attention that empathy is receiving. And we're even talking about, folks, we're even talking about a position called the Chief Empathy Officer. That's how important empathy matters in building relationships. The CEO of Microsoft says it's a leadership mantra. Leadership is about empathy. I have to take you back and remind you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dale Carnegie's book, right, on how to win friends and influence people, one of the most popular self-help books ever published. And you know that since the time of its publication, up until present day, purchases of those books, they've been reprinted and millions have been produced. And Dale Carnegie's book about how to win friends and influence people, if you haven't read it, I invite you to explore. The message there is patently clear. It's all about empathy. You win friends and you influence people if you have the capacity to be able to enter their world. I actually wrote a paper, which and there's a live link when you get the slides. I've put the link on this particular slide where you can access an article that I've written arguing that empathy is the most critical skill for any organization. In fact, we even have studies of empathy organizationally, and we have global barometers of empathy now to assess how much or how less empathic a culture you have. Let's look at the manifestation of the empathic disposition that companies might have in very concrete terms that's listed on the left side of the slide. I want to really draw your attention to the outcomes that we always seek in our organizational realities. We want higher productivity. We want high levels of motivation. We want to be able to easily acquire and retain talent. We want our employees to be committed and engaged with the ethos and culture of the company because it has consequences not only on the well-being of the individuals involved, but it has consequences from a business standpoint of financial outcomes and performance. There is enough evidence in practice, in theory, and in research that supports these outcomes as being inevitable if you have an empathic disposition. And now companies express it from a design standpoint in terms of making sure that we provide healthcare benefits, we provide maternity and bereavement leaves, we provide for childcare at home. These are all expressions of empathy. It's an expression of we understand a young couple need daycare and after-school care, especially if both couples are professionally engaged. When you have a loss in a family, do you get extended bereavement time? Maternity leave is becoming increasingly more important, and companies are responding to that, as they are to diversity and inclusion. And we're still, of course, struggling, but nevertheless, there is attention being given to pay parity, right? We want to make sure that we're paying males and females equitably. And we're still struggling with that, but that's an important response by companies that say we feel this disparity and are going to do something about it just as much as we understand. And today, more pronounced than ever before, we understand that you are concerned about your safety. Just this morning, I read a very inspiring report in the Wall Street Journal about this kidney doctor, 68 years old, caring for his patients, widespread occurrence of the coronavirus in the hospital among patients and colleagues. And so the hospital administration offered this doctor the option to cease working in the hospital, to stay at home, partly because of the concern that those folks who are on the upper end of the age continuum tend to be more susceptible to adverse consequences of this virus. And the gentleman heroically responded and said, yes, I recognize this as an important dimension of my safety, but I cannot leave my patients. I have an obligation to them. That tells you, in a very concrete sense, this person felt what his patients are feeling. And the last thing he wanted to do was to make them feel that they were being abandoned. So, if you have not yet been convinced, I hope you will by the time we're done, or after you had the opportunity to explore other pieces of literature and articles and practices about the power of empathy. It is our ability as human beings to be able to express ourselves in a way that lets us understand what life is like sitting in your shoes. It's literally a case, and I don't mean this in terms of simple language, it's literally a case of when you step into the other person's shoes, but you do so by taking on that person's pace, tonality, posture, facial expression. If you're able to do all of that, you are attuned to that person. And whenever you feel a sense of attunement, then folks, you are actually experiencing empathy. I hope, and I know all of you have experienced empathy. The more you experience it, the more gratified you will feel. So why, I mean, this is almost moot, isn't it? Why practice empathy? You practice empathy, interestingly, not just because you want the kinds of outcomes we just referenced a couple of slides ago, but you want to practice empathy because it does help you to build relationships. It helps you to collaborate. It helps you to drive engagement with your customers, your clients, your business partners, other stakeholders with whom you might be interacting with. It certainly has financial impact. Now, what most people don't realize is when you have the capacity to empathize, you actually have the capacity then to be able to understand at a deeper level and to provide opportunities for development. And that, folks, the opportunity to be able to engage in the kind of leadership where you develop other people is enormously gratifying. Just think about the pervasive value of building empathic capacity. So let's talk about empathy. In face-to-face situations, it's much easier. It's much easier to be able to, looking at the person, looking at you, to be able to hear you, to be able to see your visual cues, to be able to see your nonverbal gestures, even your smile, and the character of your smile has a certain message that's conveyed. They allow us collectively to be able to immerse ourselves in the other person's world. And so this is rich in its properties, it's vibrant in its properties, and it allows us, it allows us to be able to step into the other person's world. Now, in the current environment, can we still do the same? I would submit yes, with some variation. Remember, we are in cognitive flex. We're going to adapt. We recognize that social distance is going to keep us away, and we're not engaging in the kind of interactions we were accustomed to when we walked into the office. Now we are in the digital world. Our communication channels are through email, through phone, and yes, like this, perhaps through Zoom, Skype, WebEx. There's opportunity for us to be able to see each other. I think you're all seeing me right now, and you can therefore follow me in terms of my non-verbal messaging that you're seeing with my facial expressions and my hands moving around. You can not have this kind of reality when you're conducting communications, exchanging communications via email or telephone. This might be appropriate if you can see me through Zoom or WebEx or Skype, etc. In the channel, in the digital channel, where you don't have the facility to be able to capture voice or visual cues, use people's names, use personal pronouns, and keep sentences short. But this is, it's a reminder of what we already know. We know that most of us have a fairly narrow span of attention, right? This circumstance we're faced with actually invites us to do things that are not part of the norm, which is short sentences, even use contractions. It's even better to say, I can't rather than I cannot. It's better to say I did not, I didn't versus I did not. So use contractions as a way of reducing the verbiage that goes into messages that you craft in your emails, or for that matter, speak over the telephone. Avoid technical and formal language, keep legalities out of it, and yes, be positive, be optimistic, be gentle in your tone. And by the way, don't hesitate to use emoticons. It's already accepted now as an acceptable message of one's emotional. Be casual and always start with questions. Engage in conversation. Allow people to interact with you. Unfortunately, in the circumstance we're in right now, I'm sort of like the sage on stage, right? I am here essentially engaging in a monologue, which is very different than being in a brick and mortar environment where I'd be able to see you and I'd even be able to pick on you because of a certain facial response you have to something I've said, so that I can engage you and extract out of you the thoughts that are percolating in your head so that we can understand each other a little better. Trust is fundamental to all human relationships. When I was a doctoral student, it was an area that I had studied very much as part of my dissertation. I'm talking about many, many moons ago. But really, at its basic level, it refers to the intentions and the words and the actions of others. In other words, your facility to ascribe good intentions in the words and actions of others is what allows you to trust, and what allows you, in a reciprocal sense, be trustworthy. It is a barometer of the strength of relationships. So we should look at trust and understand its properties and understand its impact. And again, this is sort of moot, but perhaps at the risk of insulting your intelligence, this should just remind us about why trust is important. Why is it important to have trusting relationships? Because the consequences are so remarkable. The consequences are higher levels of commitment, higher levels of productivity, less burnout. You stay longer, you're a happier human being, you collaborate with others. We've even had neuroscience research that says when we trust people, we actually excrete in our brains a chemical called oxytocin, which has the property in the brain to actually increase trust, and it also influences our empathic capacity. So folks, the subject of trust and the subject of empathy even has neurological foundations. It does things to us. And there are studies, experimental studies, that have been done to actually test using blood samples about the impact that trust has on the human body and on our cognitive capacities. What I'd like to do for the next several minutes is share with you several behavioral issues that are pertinent to promoting and fostering trust. First and foremost is to be transparent and reliable, which means you've got to be honest, you've got to be vulnerable, and you have to be willing to admit mistakes. And we know how much we run from admitting mistakes. Frankly, when you have admissions, because all of us can make mistakes, do make mistakes, the fact that you're an occupant of the C-level suite versus the frontline employee at the lowest rung of the ladder does not suggest, therefore, you don't make mistakes. We have made significant mistakes, and when we admit it, we actually open ourselves out. In effect, when we admit mistakes, we in effect are acknowledging that others deserve the respect for that exposure. You're acknowledging others, and you're acknowledging their views, you're acknowledging their ideas, you're acknowledging their opinions, and in the case of digital communications via emails and telephone, it becomes all the more important that you need to adhere to certain boundaries that are very clear. Timeliness, being prompt, say what you mean, which means you've got to craft words very, very carefully, very carefully. And in many ways, the fact that we are in the telephone and email modality of communicating more than anything else actually forces us to build our craft of crafting messages with words that reflect what you mean. And if you say something you mean, make sure that you follow through with behavior that's congruent with what you say. And so you need to do what you say. By the way, being consciously intentional in attempting to build relationship is a strength. And it allows you, if you're intentional, you become personal. Always, of course, opt if you can for video calls instead of telephone calls, which we just referenced as video calls being certainly more powerful because of the visual exposure we have. But the other thing we tend to shy away from, being personal. We tend to shy away from sharing personal stories or talking about our hobbies. You'd be amazed in casual conversation with someone, a total stranger, it might be, if you're a salesperson, talking to a completely new prospect. Sharing personal stories is actually a warm thing to do because others also have stories to share. When you share stories, you open up the gate for sharing, which are so powerful. Think about sharing your hobbies. Think about conversations that triggered because of your love for a ball game, your love for baseball, your love for hockey, your love for football, or any other sport for that matter. If there are similar sort of sentiments on the other side, imagine the kind of relationship that's potentially possible. Of course, we're always communicating. This goes without saying. And I've been a professor for 40 years, and the one thing I've always heard from the corporate world when we ask them a very simple question, what skills would you like us to have our students graduate with? And I can tell you resoundingly and repeatedly and relentlessly, it's communication. build communication skills. It's almost as if though we're intoxicated by this message. But I can't help myself. I've got to tell you that this is so important in order to build trust, and not just communicate, but communicate consistently. And so ask questions, provide feedback, share information. Let's ensure that you're able to align yourself with expectations people have. So make the rules of engagement explicit. I've got to give you this terrific example. If you see that picture, I just took that picture earlier this week. It's a 120-year-old hardware store in my neighborhood. It has aisles that won't allow for social distancing, unlike the big boxes like Home Depot or Lowe's, where social distancing is actually fairly easier. Their aisles are much wider than 6 feet. And so it's not hard to navigate that space. But in a small 120-year-old mom-pop hardware store in the neighborhood, it becomes a challenge. Look at what the owners did. They said, we understand fear. We understand the environment. We understand people's needs. We are anticipating this understanding. We understand their fear. So look, they actually put a sink outside the store with a note that says, wash your hands before you enter. And I want you to pay particular attention to the power of this understanding of people's expectations. This is what I call a just for me experience. And maybe you didn't notice it, but if you can see my cursor, I'm going to take you to this foot pedal right here. This is a basic construction of a foot pedal so that you don't ever have to touch the faucet. This is a spring back, open, closed foot pedal. So you feel pretty safe about not having to touch anything that someone else's hand might have touched. This is so remarkable. Now tell me if I won't feel comfortable walking into that store. And by the way, I didn't take a picture of the dryer, but on the right side of the door that you enter, there's actually an air dryer there that invites you to dry your hands. The point of all of this is to ask yourself basic questions when you want to make sure there's an alignment between your expectations and others. Ask the question, what's working well? What's not working well? What can I do to ensure success so that I can build an enduring relationship? You know, folks, this is almost a moot slide, and I'll tell you why. Because we have already recognized the democratization of information and knowledge. Nobody has a monopoly on it. What a remarkable gateway that invites you to say, hey, be willing and generous. When you're willing and generous, don't monopolize, because frankly, if you monopolize, I can just walk with my fingers and find the information. It invites you to collaborate, share your experiences. That's how you build narrowness and reduce the space. Share your energy and do so with the grace and acknowledge and leverage people's autonomy in the circumstance we have so that we can cultivate a thread of trust between us and another party. Let me pause for just a second, and we're coming really close to the end of this journey, so our timing is actually pretty good. I couldn't help but pick up a report that was just published, 2020 report on remote work. There's 3,500 remote workers surveyed across the globe, just to find out, you know, what are the challenges and what are the great benefits that they've experienced. This, by the way, is pre-coronavirus results. So you need to understand the value of this set of items based on this study. And the set of values that the value of these things for me surfaces in the fact that when I think about tomorrow, this is going to be more anchored with our reality of tomorrow. Folks are saying, I'm challenged by collaboration, loneliness, not being able to unplug. This is the concept of burnout. I get many distractions. I'm with the family, got dogs, got sick parents, whatever it is. You're preoccupied with these challenges. The benefits are incredible. And I'm telling you, it is important to pay attention to not only having a flexible work schedule, but having the flexibility to work from anywhere. Once we're outside of our home office environments, I am submitting to you today that the world of work as we know it today and yesterday and the day before is not going to be the world of work tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to find our employees are going to make greater demands on the power of being able to have flexibility, the power of being able to work from anywhere, reduce my time and investment and energy, and in fact save money on commuting. I can spend more time with my family members. All of these things are clearly important and will become increasingly important in the world that we're stepping into tomorrow. So, where does our journey bring us? It brings us to the following summary statements. Practice cognitive flex, which essentially means a whole new mindset, a mindset that says, I've got to continuously adapt, and I've got to really leverage my capacity to be able to listen, my capacity to be able to build relationships grounded on trust, and my capacity to be able to step into someone else's world so that I can develop a deep and intimate understanding of other people. It allows me, if I do that, to shape expectations. It allows me to be able to connect with other people. And it also invites me, if you think about it in the context of the preceding slide, it allows me now to come up with, and I hope that your imagination would be triggered in terms of tomorrow's remote work model. We're going to develop a whole new different work model. And we also are going to, as I said earlier, build a much more intimate engagement with technology. It's building a digital infrastructure now has become even more important than it might have been, despite all the innovations that we've had in our society. And of course, flexibility is going to be the key here. We're going to have to be like the amoeba. We're constantly shifting and adapting to environmental contingencies. And my last point as a reminder is I've given you my address in the panel, chat panel. If you're interested, I'm happy to share with you these e-learning modules that we've developed in empathy and trust. We've gamified a lot of what I shared with you, plus more. We have levels of tournament engagement that allows you to move from one level to another. We have simulated scenarios in which you find yourself immersed in making choices around empathy and trust, which is a learning tool, and I hope you would enjoy it should you decide to take advantage of the offer that I shared with you. And on that note, I think my timing is just fine. I want to thank you for your attention. I'm sorry that I couldn't see all of you because I would have picked up so many cues. You've been watching me, and frankly, I hope you picked up a lot of cues, but I'd certainly welcome any questions that you might have that I can respond to. Gillian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you so much for a great presentation. So right now, everyone, we will definitely take your questions. Please submit them in the chat box. I do have a couple of questions here for you, Mohammed. The first question being, what was the state of remote work before the pandemic, and what will it look like in the future?
Well, let's look at the state of work. There it is. I shared that with you. This is the latest state of remote work report, the one that I used. That was just published by buffer.com. And this is the state of remote work. What were the challenges? And the challenges were identified as, the ability to be able to collaborate and communicate well, the ability, loneliness, we're all isolated and confined to spaces, not being able to unplug. Let me say something to you about flexible work schedules and remote work. When you actually invite people to work from home and give them the autonomy to be able to have flexibility, that actually is expressed in the form of gratitude, and the gratitude is manifested in not being able to unplug. In fact, people feel so grateful that they burn out. They work so much harder. There's no boundaries of start and end times in remote work environments. When you are distracted by family, you're distracted by your pets, you're distracted by illnesses, you're distracted by whatever circumstances a typical family community unit imposes upon you, you find these kinds of outcomes. Then on the other hand, people are saying, I love the flexibility. I love being able to work from anywhere. I love the fact that I'm spending more time with my family despite the distractions. I love the fact that I don't have to commute. And I'm submitting to you that what you see yesterday is just going to be exponential in terms of our attention to these same variables for the world of work tomorrow. I think remote work tomorrow is going to be a part of our reality. Gallup, in fact, Gallup did studies. The most recent study was 2019. The one that comes to my mind because I used it in a previous presentation is in 2016 that says a significant proportion of our workforce population has worked remotely at least part of the time, if not all of the time. So a significant majority is a combination of part-time and full-time remote work. I'm going to submit that we're going to see a shift, the curve, if you would. The curve is going to get skewed in the direction of remote work in the world of tomorrow. I hope that answers the question.
I believe so. I think that was a wonderful answer. I do have a couple of other questions here. The second question, can one be taught to trust others? Isn't this a gut issue?
Oh, God, no. No, it's not a gut issue. There's no doubt, though. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that intuition or gut, intuition is the term we use in the formal lexicon, sort of, what does my gut say? It's my intuition I'm talking about. Yes, can be very influential in trusting someone, in establishing a relationship that's predicated on trust. I would submit, though, that for those of us that don't take advantage of our guts, have the opportunity to build behavioral options by going through the kind of training that we have developed. And the folks that have gone through our training tell us that they've actually gotten much more sensitive, become much more aware of their behaviors that allows them to be able to establish relationships.
That's great. Another question here from our chat. Recently, managers with low trust have looked for tracking software to check up on their employees. While your recommendations are sound, can you give more details on things like remote work models and ramping up flexibility?
Well, first of all, look, folks, we are almost in a state of paranoia, almost. We also have our liberties to be concerned about, our privacy to be concerned about. Anytime that an organization decides that it's going to monitor its remote workers as a policing response, I think is an egregious mistake, an egregious mistake. It's very simple, folks. Research supports the following conclusion. If I do not feel that I am part of a culture of trust, I'm actually going to start looking for alternative employment opportunities. In other words, you will have turnover issues, you have retention issues, and no organization wants that because it's not only expensive, but it's detrimental to the performance and functioning of the organization as a healthy system. Policing people's remote work is a serious mistake. If you cannot trust people to do what you want them to do, then you have a serious problem. You have a pathology in the system. You know, what it's also going to do for us, if you think about it, let's assume for a moment that we're going to never police our folks. It's going to force us to actually become much more granular, much more thoughtful about establishing very specific and explicit performance outcome measures. So think about it. I'm asking you to do your work, deliver these outcomes. Do I care whether you do it from the Starbucks environment, from the comfort of your backyard garden, or from a beach where you have access to internet, where you have internet connection? It really doesn't matter. If we start policing, I think we're going to have another revolution.
That's great. And I definitely hear you on the policing measure. Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. How is empathy related to emotional intelligence?
Ah, well, empathy is clearly related to emotional intelligence in many ways. If you think about emotional intelligence and empathy, you know, let's talk about something we've all been guilty of, all of us, without exception. And I'm being heroic in making my assumption, as I am about all the people on this webinar who I have no idea who they are, where they come from, and I've never met you. Um, just be aware of your own emotions allows you to exercise control over how you behave. So one very important property of a couple of important properties of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, and the other is complete control over how I respond. Now, I started out by saying, I bet all of you have expressed anger. All of you have struck out under certain circumstances and then feel a powerful sense of regret. If you've ever engaged in behavior that forces you in retrospect to regret, it invites you to pay attention to the level of self-control that you've exercised. And the argument that's being made in the literature around emotional intelligence is that only you are in charge of your behavior. You are the person that can control it. And the more control you have over your behavior, the more emotionally intelligent you will be. It's as simple a formula as that. Now we can continue and make reference to Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, which is probably the best known framework there is. There are a whole host of other social skills that are essential, and all of them, by the way, are grounded in empathy as fundamental to building relationships with other human beings. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. And then we do have one last question for you here, Mohammed. If we are okay with an employee working from anywhere, how do we protect proprietary information from being overheard in conversations? Someone taking a photo of your laptop, where's the balance?
Wow, I don't know. You know, think about the privacy issue, right? Again, it's a matter of how exposed are we? You know, in fact, it turns out coincidentally, 2 days ago, I received a Google timeline of me because of my GPS, right, on my phone. And the Google timeline I saw was just eye-opening, even though I was cognitively and intellectually aware that I am being observed, that I am being tracked, that we're all being tracked. And by the way, tracing is going to be a huge thing in the future. But let me stay with this Google timeline I received. I received this timeline, and I was looking at the timeline. It said exactly where I was, at what time, on what date, which city, what restaurant. It didn't give me the granular details about, how I traveled there or what I ate. And it also said I had done 67,000 miles of traveling in 2019. I traveled internationally. It told me every country I went to. It told me every city I went to. And it told me every restaurant I went to in those cities, as long as they were part of the Google infrastructure, right? So, I think the reality of tomorrow, based on what we're hearing in the news around this menace that we're faced with, when they're talking about tracing, right? Google and Apple right now collaborating on building tracing software so that we can tell if you've been infected by the virus, who you have connected with, so that we can in some way contain, or to use the term that's being used repeatedly in our conferences every day, is mitigate the spread of this disease that's enveloped our psyche and our health. Not sure if I've answered the question, but I hope I did.
I believe so. That was a great answer. Unfortunately, everyone, I think that's all the time we have today. I'm happy to send some questions. Mohammed's email address is in here as well, as he referenced earlier in the chat box. I'll send it to the bottom. I'll send it to everyone again so you all have access to it for those materials he mentioned. Mohammed, thank you again for taking the time to share your knowledge with us, and thank you to all of you for joining today's webinar. On behalf of ATD PHL, thanks again and enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, folks. Bye-bye.